Well, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, good morning, and good night if you're listening to the recording, which you may well be. This is really just a quick run through value chain analysis. It should be short and sweet, just to supplement your textbook, but nearly everything I say here can be found in the book if you prefer to read. And of course, this is another term that comes from our friend Porter, and he says that the business of a firm can best be described as a value chain. And that is a value chain in which total revenues minus total costs of all the activities undertaken, i.e. to develop and market a product or service, yield value. And then what we're talking about here is value chain analysis, which refers to the process where a firm determines the costs associated with these activities, the organizational activities, whether they be purchasing raw materials or manufacturing products or marketing those products. So let's make a start. And you can see here, that's an original graphic from Porter, which is of course aging a little bit now, but Porter made such a contribution to strategic thinking that it's important that you have a grounding in Porter's ideas. So it's basically a model that helps firms find competitive advantage within each activity. So perhaps you can compete with other firms in operations or logistics or places like that. Now you'll also see, I'll go into this later, but he divides these activities into primary and support, and we will talk about that. Okay, so it's value chain analysis as a strategy tool used to analyze the internal activities of the firm. And the goal is to recognize which are the most valuable or which might give you a competitive advantage, or alternatively, which ones don't and could be improved. So Porter says on the one hand, it does seem slightly contradictory, but competitive advantage can only be understood by looking at the firm as a whole, but cost advantages and successful differentiation are found by considering the chain of activities. And so this model he's made of the value chain divides the generic value-adding activities into primary and secondary, which is what I mentioned, or primary and support. And within each of these categories, you might find an advantage or disadvantage, but when you put them all together, you get the value chain of the firm. Okay, so we're looking for insights into the effectiveness of this chain to deliver the product or service of the firm, so it can apply to service companies too. And we're looking for advantages and disadvantages. So we break the chain down into discrete activities, and then we can look at the relative performance of each of those discrete activities. And remember, while you're doing all this analysis, to keep in mind the whole point is to try and develop a competitive advantage. That's the whole point of doing this value chain analysis. Okay, so apart from that, it can also be used for outsourcing and offshoring decisions, or even make or buy decisions, which can result in a cost or differentiation advantage. So there are further applications. Okay, what questions will it help you answer? These are the questions it might answer, this VCA, as I call it. What value does each activity that my organization undertakes add? What is the total combined value of all these activities in relation to the cost? So it will help you answer those questions if you do a value chain analysis. Well, we've already talked about discrete activities, and Porter, as we've already said, divides them into two categories. Some examples of what he calls primary activities might be inbound logistics, operations, outbound logistics, marketing and sales and services. And what Porter refers to as support activities could include procurement, technology development, human resource management, or infrastructure. And we look at each activity to see where it's adding value. Okay. Going into a little bit of depth into the primary value chain activities. I won't read the entire thing out, but let's say looking at the value chain definition of service. This is concerned with maintaining the product after sale, thus guaranteeing quality or adding value in other ways, such as installation, training, servicing, providing spare parts, upgrading. And what service does is enhance the product value and allows for after-sale interaction. And you can read the rest at your leisure. If we look at support activities, and we'll do the same, let's pick one like technology development. So we have procurement, technology development, HR management, infrastructure. Porter refers, and remember he was writing this in 1985, but he refers to activities such as R&D, product and or process improvements, redesign and developing new services, which I think is relatively still applicable. All right, well, since he introduced this model in the mid-80s, it's been extensively used to map companies' strengths and shortcomings by strategic planners. And when strategic alliances and merger and acquisition deals are analyzed, they often use the value chain. So you might, if you haven't already, you might well come across it or a variation of it at work. And an example might be if one company in the merger is strong in logistics and the other in sales and services, then once merged, they'd make an agile, highly commercial competitor. So you might seek out partners that compensate for weaknesses in your value chain. And there's another diagram of the Porter value chain. You'll see various versions of it. Okay, so how can we use the value chain? Here's some examples. Looking at the primary and secondary, you can visualize the company or a competitor. You can do a quick and dirty identification of lack of strengths with it. You can compare competitive strengths with a competitor, or you can use the analysis to look at a match for mergers and acquisitions. For example, here this shows in gray the bits that you have a competitive advantage in. You find a competitor who has a competitive advantage in the bits you're missing, merge it, and you should have the perfect firm. And if we look at this firm as a chain of activities, now this, I believe, is in your book, so you probably already read it, but I'll go over it rapidly. There's an example of looking at the firm as a chain of activities. So you have R&D, purchasing, feeding into operations, then warehousing, going through to distribution, customer service and so on, and marketing and sales coming to customer and warehousing, and then your planning and central services. So that's one way you could look at a value chain. And let's look at a value chain of a winemaker, which we should all have some familiarity with perhaps. And there you have it, vine maintenance, vine irrigation, the harvesting and so on, all the way through to marketing, wholesale, direct sales from the cellar door, exports, retail, then you've got freight. So you could look at every one of these activities and see where you have or do not have a competitive advantage. Now, it's interesting. I think this is in the current edition of the book. It's an IKEA value proposition, and we're all familiar with IKEA, I'm sure, and how they revolutionized furniture with their flat pack concept. And we'll look at how exactly you could collect the information to look at each activity. Now, if you look at, say, what is IKEA's target customer segment, beginning here, we'd say value-conscious, time-poor retail furniture purchasers who value international style. So what benefits are currently delivered? Low-cost stylish furniture, speedy delivery. Maybe I've ordered from IKEA and it annoyed me because you go on the web and you buy something, pay for it, and then at the end it says, now you have to phone up and organize it. And that annoyed me because I thought, I don't want to do that. I've already paid for it. I've ordered it. I know what I want. Just send the darn thing. So I'm not sure about the speedy delivery. Maybe that's a technical issue they need to fix. Okay, so their important activities are product design, manufacture at low cost, retail traffic flow management, product availability. So how could you collect this data. And there's a form here that we've called developing and delivering a value proposition. You could have a form something like this. Design your own. This one's from Hubbard, another book called Practical Australian Strategy. But you'd look at the segment you're looking at or the part of the value chain and ask, what is the value proposition / critical benefits of the organization to the particular customer segment? What other critical benefits does the customer desire that the organization could deliver but currently does not? So here you put your benefit. Is it superior? Is it currently delivered? And then what important activities must the organization perform well in order to deliver this benefit to customers? And I think what I like about this form, I don't like forms in general. I find people make them overly complex and people don't bother to fill them out because they're too hard or take up too much valuable time. But this I like. Customer, customer, customer. It's the right idea. Focus on your customers. I think Peter Drucker, one of the great strategic management thinkers and academics, said the sole purpose of business is to create and keep customers. And the number of times I see time wasted in my opinion, and perhaps Mr. Drucker's too, but meetings and business and forms that have nothing to do with increasing customer value. And that's why I like this form. It's all focused on customer value anyway. Okay, so here's a shot of IKEA's business model to deliver its value proposition. They have a centralized product design, manufacture in low-cost countries, keep the costs down, ship in efficient loads, large stores in low-cost locations, and so on. Value for money, style, and so on. So that's how IKEA is looking at their value chain. And of course, on that note, there's a lot of kerfuffle and worry in Australian retail at the moment about the coming of the Amazon giant, and I think Kanchana in her presentation mentioned this, which was great. But yeah, one thing Amazon does very, very well is keep the costs down in the value chain, and that's where perhaps the sort of plump partridges of Australian retail who've had it so good for so long may find themselves hurting when they get a real cost competitor in town. So we shall see. All right, well, remember, to every theory and every thing we study, value chain SWOT, there's always a downside. And one of those for value chain is it's difficult to measure or rate competitive strengths objectively. When you're trying to map the entire value chain and try to give it quantitative numbers or ratings, often you'll have to employ strategic analysts, planners, consultants. Obviously, there's a cost. And to compensate for some of these issues, there's a term called value grid, and this has been introduced recently. I have actually put quite a good article on it in Canvas under the general info link toward the top. So that might be worth having a look at if you're interested. But the value grid, instead of having a linear value chain, tends to look at a multi-dimensional value chain with every part affecting every other part, which is kind of nice, a more holistic view. So that's been the evolution of the value chain. And this is part of this shifting away from the strict view of the traditional chain. But, like in this unit, if you start with the classics, the sort of Iliads and Odysseys of strategy, and then move along and then blow it all out of the water with disruption. But at least you have a foundation and a basis so you know what rules you're breaking. I mean, it's all about disruption, they say these days, and of course Uber's the big one. And I did also put an article up about how Uber's looking at introducing plane rides that are as cheap as a car ride into New Zealand and Sydney too, I believe. And on that note too, I saw that Domino's, which has dominated the fast food area with its high-tech approach, didn't have such a good result. A couple of days ago, the shares fell away, and they are also looking at delivery by drone in the very near future. Anyway, those are just points to ponder. So thank you for listening to that. I hope it was of some use. And of course, if you follow the learning materials and the readings, you'll be gurus on value chain analysis if you aren't already. So thanks again. I hope you have a great consolidation week soon. And I'll see you next time or on the boards.